The era of Western nations tolerating people who do not tolerate the West has to end. We've allowed too many people into Western societies who hate who we are, who don't share our values. What we are witnessing is a civilizational moment. It's insane what we're living through. The British people have been lied to by Boris Johnson and pretty much every frontline mainstream politician of the last 20 years, because the British people have been consistently told they would get lower migration and high-skill migration. What they got was everybody's crying out for brave, courageous voices that will stare down the mob. I then watched a number of my friends basically be thrown out of the universities or be harassed and discriminated against because of their politics. I thought that was disgusting. Some of them will say openly they're taking medication to go to sleep at night because of the stress and the mental toll. For every 3 left-wing academics, there was 1 conservative academic. Today, for every 9 left-wing academics, there is 1 conservative academic.
Do we blame the students, or do we blame the adults who started letting the students have an inordinate amount of power?
Jonathan Haidt in the United States has made this argument, Jordan Peterson has made this argument, but actually, where I have gone further than others is...
Give me a little insight for those maybe outside the country or who don't know about your background.
Yeah, well, I was born in England. I became an academic, became a professor of political science. I work mainly on politics, voting, elections, the rise of populism, why people are so fed up with the status quo. And I've also become increasingly fed up with the status quo. And I suppose I'm known mainly in Britain and Europe as being a commentator, probably a challenging voice, provocative voice. I write a Substack, which is one of the biggest in the UK. And I generally annoy all the right people. So
that's an interesting place to start. So what is maybe your most challenging and controversial point that annoys the right people?
Well, I wouldn't say this is a controversial point, given that 80% of people agree with it in certainly Britain and much of Europe, which is, firstly, I'm very skeptical of mass immigration. I think it's a policy disaster that is weakening, not strengthening our economy and societies. I'm very skeptical of the established institutions. I think there are lots of people now, millions of people, who simply don't feel like they have a voice in the national conversation. I'm very comfortable with things like Brexit and the rise of populist parties. I think they are bringing a silver lining into politics. I think they're correcting the system in many ways. So these all put me on, the wrong side of the, or outside of the Overton window, which dominates the mainstream conversation, especially for somebody who works in universities, which, as we know, over the last 60 years have moved sharply to the left. So if you are like me, if you think on balance, actually, you're pretty comfortable with Britain leaving the EU, you think mass immigration is out of control, you're deeply concerned about the direction of Western societies, you're deeply concerned about the rise of radical Islamism, the woke left, the threats to free speech and free expression, that puts you in maybe 1 or 2% on campus. So it's been an interesting 10 years, and I'm sure we'll talk a bit about that.
Yeah, I do want to know, actually, how did that start to feel? And the reason I ask is because a lot of us do these podcasts and we say, oh, bloody woke and bloody this and that, and there's the bravado layer here. But how's it actually impacted your day-to-day life, and what does it feel like?
Yeah, so I think there are a number of turning points for me. The first arrived in 2016 with that big Brexit referendum before Donald Trump's victory in November. And then you could sense something was brewing. And unlike most of the people in the universities, when Britain voted to leave the EU, an organization which I've always felt was insufficiently democratic, it was not a genuine democracy. It was overly bureaucratic, it's quite corrupt, and it's also very inefficient. But when Brits voted for that, I thought, well, okay, let's do Brexit. So that instantly, and the reaction to that, the hostility, the way in which the elites described Brexit voters, much like they described Trump voters later on as the deplorables, bigots, gammons, Karens, the rest of it. I thought that was disgusting. And that began to push me in a political journey. I then watched a number of my friends basically be thrown out of the universities or be harassed and discriminated against because of their politics. Not just people like Jordan Peterson, who was disinvited from Cambridge, but scholars like Noah Carl, who was essentially chased out of Cambridge because students protested that he was looking at controversial areas like intelligence and was a moderate conservative scholar. Kathleen Stock, the philosopher who was gender critical, she was chased out of Sussex. My good friend Eric Kaufman, who was essentially chased out of Birkbeck. And I just watched this intolerance playing out among the very people who claim to be the most tolerant of all. And that too, I think, I don't want to say radicalized me, but certainly made me question many of the assumptions and ideological priors that I had. And so increasingly, as I've moved away from the universities into, let's say, the public realm, the public debate, and I've realized just how many people are so utterly frustrated with this status quo in America, Canada, Britain, Europe. Everybody's crying out for basically brave, courageous voices that will stare down the mob and will explain through the lens of evidence and reason why so many of these policies are completely disastrous. And that's essentially my journey.
I've got big news. Heretics is expanding to Substack. I'll be writing weekly articles about the madness of the woke mind virus, and also giving out little snippets and things I've learned from episodes with new guests that haven't even gone live on YouTube yet. In just 6 months, you grew this community from 0 to 150,000 subscribers. But Heretics is expensive to run. With its camera team, guest booker, production assistant, top-of-the-range 4K cameras, moving sliders, editors, and social media, it costs about £10,000 or $13,000 a month. How can you help? Well, I don't want to rely on ads. You, the viewers, are the economic engine that will drive Heretics to the next level. I'm talking about tours, time to make longer episodes, and bigger guests. This month on Substack, I am writing about the email I received that cancelled me from my own book tour, the 10 signs that gender ideology is a cult, and whether Britain and the US are racist countries. You'll also get the ad-free podcast early and be able to ask questions to my guests, so you'll really be part of the Heretics community. Most of the content is free with perks for paid members. My first article is up now, and it's something I've been holding back and wanting to get off my chest for a long time. So go and sign up on andrewgoldheretics.substack.com. There's a theory that students going to university, they need to have that time where they break away from what their parents' views might be. Maybe they get a bit irrational, but do we blame the students, or do we blame the adults who started letting the students have an inordinate amount of power?
I mean, it's a good question. I think within the higher education sector that there are a couple of things going on. I think the first is, over the last 60 years, all the evidence shows this, universities have swung sharply to the left. I'll give you one example. Here in Britain in the 60s, for every 3 left-wing academics, there was 1 conservative academic.
Wow.
Today, for every 9 left-wing
right,
academics, there is 1 conservative academic. So what's the problem with that? Well, when you have an ideological monoculture like that, where only some beliefs are allowed to dominate campus, that emboldens extremists. It emboldens the radical, the woke left, the social justice left that is going even harder and faster at taking over the university bureaucracy. It encourages discrimination against political minorities like conservatives, gender critical scholars. My friends in history who have said actually the legacy of empire in Britain or American history is more complicated and nuanced than the New York Times or The Guardian might have us believe. So it encourages that discrimination. But most of all, it lets down students. And what's happened is, as the universities have moved sharply to the left, they've also become obsessed with student satisfaction, which is the perceptions of students on campus. And that's now the overriding metric. Are students having a good time? Not are they having a rigorous, intellectually demanding education, but are they having a good, comfortable time? And if they're not, then the university will essentially fall over itself to do whatever it needs to do to ensure that students come first. So removing controversial speakers, chasing controversial academics off campus, reshaping campus life around the more liberal, progressive values and worldviews of students. So we're letting them down, essentially. And I'm not the only person saying this, obviously. Jonathan Haidt in the United States has made this argument. Jordan Peterson has made this argument. But actually, where I have gone further than others is I actually campaigned here in the UK for laws that would that are essentially now forcing universities to protect and promote free speech.
Oh,
So we've gone a lot further than some of our counterparts in saying, actually, we no longer trust the universities to reform themselves. We're going to push, we did push for a new law here in the UK, the Higher Education Free Speech Act. Again, made me very unpopular among my colleagues, but now the universities have a legal requirement to promote and protect free speech on campus. And if you're sacked or you're removed from campus because of your political views, universities can now be heavily fined and sanctioned as a result. Now, I don't like to use the state in this way, but sometimes actually when the institutions won't reform themselves, I think intervention is necessary.
It's making my head swim a bit because I'm thinking we want free speech because of the authoritarian state of universities at the moment. So we have to implement an authoritarian measure to enforce it.
Yeah, I think that's partly right. I mean, but I wouldn't describe it as authoritarian. I would say when you've got institutions that are leaning so strongly in one ideological direction, you do actually have to intervene to try and level the playing field. And because the evidence on just what is happening on campus is so overwhelming in the US and the UK, we have alarmingly large numbers of academics who openly say, they won't have lunch with a Trump voter, they won't have lunch with a Brexit voter, they wouldn't hire an academic to an Ivy League college if they knew that academic had Republican sympathies. In many liberal arts colleges, there are no Republicans. We have to ensure that these universities actually allow for a wide range of views, because look, there are friends of mine who would say the answer is giving up on the institutions and establishing alternative universities. I'm more nervous about that because I think in the end what you get are essentially segregation along political lines, and you get these parallel institutions. My view is, no, let's stay and let's fight and let's reform the institutions so they can actually present and promote a wider range of views, and dissenters and unorthodox academics and others can keep their places within those institutions.
That's really interesting because Peter Boghossian is one of those. He wants his own.
Peter's a good friend of mine.
Yeah, me too. And he wants to make his own universities, I think.
I think there's a role for that. What Peter's doing, what the guys at the University of Boston are doing, Neil Ferguson, Eric Kaufman at Buckingham. These are important people making a difference. But I'm not ready to give up on the established institutions. And I'm not just talking about universities and colleges here. I'm talking about legacy media. I'm talking about the cultural institutions, the creative industries, the museums, the galleries. I'm talking about NPR, BBC, New York Times, whatever. Over the next 10, 20 years, I think we're either going to reform these institutions or we're going to see, wholesale polarization between liberals and conservatives. Now, I'd rather not see that. I'd rather actually work within those institutions, and even if it means intervening, try and force a better conversation and a better representation of views.
You didn't say how it actually felt for you being pushed to the sidelines. You avoided that, or pushed out by the sort of legacy people or the former colleagues and things.
I think there are two stages. I think when you are in the institutions, and I've talked with many other professors, if I were to say their names now, you would, the viewers would know immediately who they are. I'm talking about top level, global names. And I've talked to them about what they've experienced in universities as well by expressing countercultural views. Some of them will say openly they're taking medication to go to sleep at night because of the stress and the mental toll. But it comes down to two stages. I think stage one is shock, anxiety, and worry. Nobody likes to be bullied. Nobody likes to be harassed. Nobody likes to face regular pile-ons on social media. Nobody likes to go through the process of character assassination, which is what academics will do to people that they perceive to be opposing or just questioning the new religion on campus, the social justice ideology, the wokeism, whatever your preferred term. Stage two, and only some people get to stage two, is no, to hell with that. I'm actually going to dig in and I'm going to stare these guys down. And I think there are a few people that we can see around the world who got to stage two, and we all know who they are because they're still fighting. They're in the trenches and they've built up ecosystems. They've built up YouTube channels and Substacks and think tanks and non-profits and all the rest of it. And stage 2, I think, is where you really get people with courage and resilience. And what my experience, and you might have some thoughts on this yourself, but my experience is that stage 1 is really, really difficult. But stage 2, you realize that when you stand up to the mob, there isn't actually much there. They don't really know what to do with you. They'll try and counsel you, but beyond that, if you survive that, you're basically fine. And other people will come. You will lose friends, but you will make many more friends along the way because people rally around courage and strength. And I think many people, perhaps like many people watching this show, sense how high the stakes are now. And I think they can sense that actually what we are witnessing is a civilizational moment. By that, I mean what we are trying to do is to not just defend, but reassert the values, the traditions, and the ways of life, and the collective memory and the history that essentially is what makes us who we are. And so people can sense now, because of the rise of radical Islamism, the rise of the woke left, because of the collapse of strength and courage among the political class, with the exception of a few, individuals, people can sense that actually if something doesn't start to change in the next few years, then it really will be too late to respond to this civilizational moment that we're in.
If somebody's just stumbled across this channel, hasn't seen it before, and they're hearing us talk about something like immigration as a bit of an issue, that's going to be maybe for them a red flag, like these are bad people. So what are some facts and statistics you can give me that might shock those people into understanding that actually there might be some concerns around mass immigration?
Sure. I mean, I think one of the problems we've got within this conversation are social norms around immigration. This kind of, as you say, instinctive reaction to, well, if you're criticizing immigration, that must have something to do with race or racism. And that reflects how strong the taboo is around this issue and how much it's been expanded over the last 20 years. So terms like racism, hate, misinformation, disinformation, what essentially we've seen over the last 20 years, I would argue, is the expansion of those social norms so that entirely legitimate, acceptable speech and views on those issues is repackaged as being somehow illegitimate and unacceptable. The way to cut through that, I found, is to have an evidence-led conversation about the effects of mass migration on our society. So I'll give you a couple. We now know from across Europe that the kind of migration that we are now experiencing from outside of Europe, much of it is low wage, low skill migration that is taking more out of Western economies than it is putting in. So if you're a rational, GDP calculating, cost benefit analysis kind of person, just simply through a policy lens, you would look at mass immigration and say, this actually isn't working anymore, because what we're doing is we're just throwing bodies at the economy. We're getting people to consume. But as we can see, for example, here in the UK, GDP per head is declining. We're not innovative. We're not dynamic. Why is that? Because one of the big reasons is because we are importing low wage, low skill, non-selective migration from areas like Pakistan, India, Nigeria. And I think that in itself is one of the strongest arguments before you get to things like housing, where clearly mass immigration is worsening the housing crisis. We see it in Canada, a big acceptance now that the experiment with mass immigration, as in Sweden, has been a complete disaster. And now in the UK, we have a lot of evidence to show much the same, which is that it is driving up rents, it's driving up house prices, and essentially is pricing out British kids and British families from the housing market. And that's before you get to what we'd call the cultural arguments, before you'd get to the dissolution of our shared cultural memory, the dissolution of shared cultural values that are needed to create high trust, cohesive societies. Robert Putnam at Harvard made this argument 10 years ago, which is that in highly diverse societies that are experiencing rapid ongoing demographic change, you tend to have lower levels of social trust. You tend to have weaker social cohesion. Communities find it's harder to keep them stuck together. And as a consequence, you then get higher levels of political distrust. You get lots of voters turning to populist parties. You get more polarization. My argument has been pretty consistently that elites need to listen to voters by dramatically lowering migration, by developing new policies for integrating who is already in Western societies, and by reasserting what is it that actually holds us together as a society. What are our values? What's our shared history? What's our shared culture? What are our ways of life? And also, what are the lines in the sand? Because we need to start drawing some lines in the sand as to who we're going to allow into our country and who we're not. And one of my arguments has been the era of Western nations tolerating people who do not tolerate the West has to end. That's one of the critical underlying points in our time today, because the more that we tolerate people who don't tolerate us, the quicker we're going to lose these societies.
I saw this morning as well, somebody said just to keep up with immigration now, we have to build 250,000 homes per year just to keep up with.
Well, that's too low, actually.
Wow.
I'll give you some stats in the UK. We built 170,000 homes last year. The government target is 300,000 homes. So we're not even coming close to meeting the government target. But here's the thing. If we maintain the current rate of immigration into the UK, net immigration this year in 2024, just coming up, the latest data that we've got, 685,000 a year, okay? Just to maintain the demand, which is overwhelmingly being driven by migration, we need to be building 515,000 homes every year going forward. We're about 4 million homes short of what we need. So what I'm saying is, look at where a country like the UK is going. Between now and 2036, if you take the government's own forecast, we're going to have another 6.5 million people coming into the country in 12 years. That's basically 10% population growth in little over a decade. So it took us 50 years to go from 55 million people to 65 million people. It's going to take us 20 years to go from 65 million to 75 million. The pace of change that we're going to see in this country over the next decade, people haven't really even begun to understand how much change we're going to see. 92% of all of our population growth here in the UK will be down to immigration. So we are going to become very quickly a much more ethnically, religiously, culturally, demographically diverse society, where I think it's going to become obvious to everybody pretty quickly that because a lot of that migration is from outside of Europe, it's going to become incredibly hard for us to simultaneously maintain the cultural bonds, the values, the traditions, the ways of life that make us who we are, that define our society. So it isn't just about GDP. It isn't just about housing. To go back to the 60s and something Bobby Kennedy said is it's also about all the things that GDP doesn't measure. It's about, our ability to get on with our neighbors, our sense of belonging, our belief in the better side of our country and the better side of who we are. A lot of that stuff is going to be challenged over the next 10 years in ways that I don't think we can really currently comprehend.
It's really scary. I'm not somebody who is that au fait with the microcosm of daily government things. So can you explain in a sort of lay level, who is the person in government now going, well, we need more of this, and why?
Well, I would say what we have is a political class overall, both within the mainstream political parties and the bureaucracy of government departments, that lean much further to the cultural left than the average voter. And that includes the Conservative Party, by the way. This idea that what we're living through in much of Europe is a kind of resurgence of the Third Reich and hard right politics is something that liberals like to talk about. But I mean, it's clearly not actually borne out in terms of policy. If you were to take somebody like Boris Johnson and the British Tories, well, they've liberalised the immigration system to a degree that not even New Labour and Tony Blair would have done. They've presided over an explosion of immigration. And that has partly been pushed on by people in the Treasury, economic-minded civil servants who view mass migration as basically a sticking plaster for many of the problems that we don't really want to fix. So they're looking at, how we can keep people working in the social care system, how we can keep people working in the National Health Service, how we can keep international students going into the universities. The more difficult longer-term solutions to those problems is to think about, well, how do you pay more people, pay people more money in the social care system? How do you get more British kids to go into the National Health Service? Do we need as many universities as we currently have? Is the higher education system really working? But instead of dealing with all of that, what we have is a political class that is basically saying, well, let's just use mass migration as a way of putting off these choices, and let's have an era of what I would argue is managed decline. And I think across the West, what we're living in is an era of managed decline. And it's not a conspiracy, it's just a combination of incompetence, ideological motivations on the left of politics, and I think a lot of conservative centre-right politicians who are unwilling to challenge the dominant consensus and the status quo. And those who do, like Donald Trump or Marine Le Pen or Nigel Farage or the Brexiteers or whoever, are roundly criticised for doing so and are basically, attacked nonstop. So we have a kind of embedded political class that I think is fully invested in this policy of mass migration.
Do we need some amount of? Sorry, this just seems mad. This just seems really mad, and it's maddening. And we're seeing the country just fall apart before our eyes right now.
It's insane what we're living through. I'll just give you one stat, just so viewers don't, because they might not know this. We've had 2 million people come into the UK over the last 2 or 3 years. 2 million people. What percentage of those do you think came in on a high-skilled working visa, that came in to take high-skill, good jobs that are driving growth in the economy?
No, it must be relatively low.
15%. 15%. So you say, who are the rest? Well, the rest are relatives of those workers, students, relatives of students, asylum seekers, illegal migrants. A lot of people coming in to do jobs that are below the median wage, are low skill, non-selective. And so what I'm saying, just to be absolutely clear, the British people have been lied to by Boris Johnson, Dominic Cummings, and pretty much every frontline mainstream politician of the last 20 years, because the British people have been consistently told they would get lower migration and high-skill migration. What they got was mass migration, uncontrolled migration, low-skill migration, low-wage migration, which is surely steadily undermining the country and essentially diluting who we are. And nobody's being real with people about this. The US is going through a very similar process, the collapse of control on the southern border, the rapid increase in illegal and legal migration. Canada has now finally accepted that this policy has been a disaster. Sweden, people on the left and the right now accept mass migration has been a complete catastrophe, leading to open gang violence and bombings in downtown Stockholm. The Germans are now coming to the same conclusion, as are the Italians. The only people who aren't are the sort of radical, for lack of a better word, woke left people who tend to dominate the institutions and the architecture of politics. But the average person out there on the street can sense what's happening. They can sense it's a disaster. They know it's suppressing their wages. They know it's undermining the economy. And more importantly, they know it's putting themselves and their families at risk, because what we now have is a very real and present security risk, which we can see in the aftermath of October 7th. More clearly than ever before, we've allowed too many people into Western societies who hate who we are, who don't share our values, and who are not fully invested in upholding the rule of law, our traditions, culture, and ways of life.
Does Australia have a different system then, when they're a little bit more picky about who they let in?
The Australians have had a points-based system, and that was the original inspiration for what Boris Johnson tried to do in the UK. But what quickly became apparent is that basically the government had no real interest in implementing a high skill policy. So they essentially lowered all the salary thresholds. They've now been trying to raise them to deal with the mess they've created, and they've simultaneously lost control of the borders, because while the UK left the European Union through Brexit, we didn't actually leave many of the things that would have allowed us to genuinely take control of our borders, like the European Convention on Human Rights. We didn't reform the Human Rights Act. We didn't reform things like the Equalities Act as well. So many things that were left over by Tony Blair and the Labour governments, Boris Johnson and the Conservatives could have completely rewired this country. They could have completely set a different foundation. But for the Americans looking in at the UK, if you really want to understand why this fiasco and this failure has continued, I have to say Boris Johnson is a major reason why, because he was never really a conservative. He was a bohemian liberal who basically liberalized the whole system.
Oh my God. Have we gotten to a point of, and it sounds like we have, of no return, especially with regards to political Islamism?
Well, I wouldn't say a point of no return. I would say what we are witnessing, particularly in the aftermath of October 7th, though it's been a long time coming, is the rise of sectarianism in our politics. And by that, what I mean is the organization of politics around openly ethnic, religious lines. And we've seen this in the rise of people like George Galloway, who have specifically targeted British Muslim voters. We've seen it in the rise of now Green Party councillors at the local level who are, celebrating their election by screaming Allahu Akbar and
Ali.
Yeah, etc. and so on. And we also see it in the surveys. I mean, we've had recent surveys that suggest 40% of British Muslims would like a Muslim-only political party. And we see it in very high levels of segregation in large parts of non-London England. People like Ed Hussein have talked about this quite openly. I was quite influenced by his book Among the Mosques, where he turned up unannounced and made the point that in many parts of England, particularly outside of the big cities, although in some areas of London too, if you are a young British Muslim, you can essentially live your life now without integrating into wider British society. You can go to heavily segregated schools, you can go to your neighborhood, you can go to the mosque, you can basically live in isolation from wider British society. The attitudes that we've seen in surveys regarding the events of October 7th, we've seen alarmingly large numbers of British Muslims denying the murder and rape of Jews on October 7th, which I found particularly uncomfortable. And we've seen very high levels of support and sympathy for Hamas. So we have a serious problem in the UK, which is feeding off two things. One is a continuation of the policy of mass immigration, which needs to stop. And the other has been the continued failure of our elites to integrate societies, to basically do what the Danes and now the Swedes have been trying to do, which is to be much more assertive and robust at integrating different communities into a shared national community. It's impossible to do that while running mass immigration, I would argue. I think where we're probably going to end up is needing some kind of break, like a 5-year break on migration, and trying to incentivize and essentially force some kind of assimilation and integration at the local level. Otherwise, we're going to end up with much higher rates of segregation. We're going to end up with lots more white flight, where white Brits are basically moving out of more diverse areas. And we're going to end up with this more sectarian politics, which is going to be much more organized along ethnic, racial, religious lines, which I don't think any of us want to see. But that will be the inevitable consequence of this, partly because, too, the rise of radical Islamism is feeding directly off the rise of the cultural left. And what I've argued is there is a toxic alliance between the two movements now. We have to be clear in our thinking. What is it that the radical cultural left and radical Islamists have in common? They're both illiberal. They both prioritize group identities over individual rights. They're both revolutionary. They want to overthrow Western societies and our ways of life. They're both suspicious, if not hostile, to objective scientific evidence and knowledge that undermines their core claims. They both use blasphemy codes to shut down dissenters. You're either a racist or you're Islamophobic. They're both, religious movements. I mean, the woke left is a new religion, to quote John McWhorter, the professor at Columbia. And so they've got a lot in common. But because the woke left tend to dominate many of the institutions, the identity politics that they are embedding within the institutions, within our schools, within our universities, gives a free pass to radical Islamists because they're a minority. So essentially within the worldview of the woke left, which I would define as being really about the viewing all minority groups as sacred and morally superior to the majority, radical Islamists get a free pass, which is what we've seen every week in London on the protests against Israel and where we've seen open support for Hamas. Islamist terrorists have been given a free pass because the woke left allows that to happen. And that is what I'm concerned about. It is the interplay between the two. It's that toxic combination.
Now, I've now got to a point where every episode of the podcast I say that Hitchens quote that I've now forgotten, but the barbarians never take a city until someone holds the gates open for them.
Well, I think what is concerning is the extent to which I've passed through an institution where it's become very visible to me how strongly embedded the identity politics, or what Yasha Monk would call the identity trap, is now in our institutions. That it pervades everything. This binary worldview of minorities being sacred and the majority white group, including Jews, being morally inferior and so on. We don't need to rehash the identity politics stuff. But what worries me, firstly, the extent to which moderate liberals and centrists are going along with this and not calling it out, even though they know it's not defending the heart of liberal democracy, which is about pluralism, bargaining, compromise. The lack of organization among those who are trying to oppose it, and also the generational trend. So if you look at all of the major surveys that my friend Eric Kaufman, among others, have shown, the millennials and the Gen Z, the Zoomers who are coming up behind my generation, Gen X, are more fully invested in that ideology than Gen X and the baby boomers, much more fully invested in seeing the world through this very warped lens, backed up by the celebrity class and social media. So we have to, I think, hold people more to account at trying to get back to these shared stories about who we are, which aren't just about, our group identities. There has to be something else, and it has to be rooted in, a reassertion of who we are and not being apologetic about who we are.
Do we need some levels of immigration? Does everyone need immigration?
Of course we do. Yeah, we need some immigration. I have no problem at all in saying we probably, in the UK, would need somewhere around maybe a net migration rate of somewhere around 50,000, maybe between 50 and 100K over the longer term, but it needs to be high skill. Ideally, migration from culturally compatible similar nations, and migration that is not only built around filling gaps in our economy, but is also built around strengthening the cultural and social fabric that makes us who we are. So that's where most voters are, by the way. Most voters are saying, look, my ideal level of migration is probably around 50,000 net migration. But as I say, in the short term, what we might need is actually just a break on migration of some description, because what we have at the moment is completely unsustainable.
Man, it does sound quite depressing, because I don't think you believe for a second that they are going to do something like that, the politicians.
No, I have come to the view that our politics is completely broken, and we're going to need some kind of new movement or vessel that is going to basically reassert the values and the values and the voice of ordinary people, that is going to be anchored in the principle of popular sovereignty, which is going to put, a bit like Brexit, the majority view against the elite minority. And on these issues like immigration, crime, embedding a principle of national preference into the economy, into housing, we see large majorities of people, 70, 80% are very supportive of all of those things. So I'm of the view that after 2024, we've got massive elections in Europe, the UK, the US. I think there has to now be a new generation of people who can actually come forward and say, look, this political consensus isn't working. The status quo isn't working. The political parties that were built in the time of the Industrial Revolution, they're no longer really working for a majority of people in the country. We're going to need something different. The question is, what is that thing? What does it look like? And who does it draw together? It needs to position itself as being above left and right, and it needs to speak very loudly for the forgotten majority. And if it does that, and it does it convincingly and in a credible way, it will be enormously successful, because I'm firmly of the view that the political zeitgeist that we currently have, big state, high tax, mass migration, low growth, pro-woke, is completely at odds with where the vast majority of people are. And we've seen that in places like Scotland. We've seen it in places like New Zealand, in Canada, in Australia. When a lot of these elite positions are put before the people, they are rejected en masse. So we need to create new political vehicles.
Why do we pander so much to the woke? Because it appears that they would lose any kind of election. They don't seem to make up any kind of majority. Why are they being pandered to?
I don't think that they're being pandered to. I think they have power. I think they have consolidated their power over the last 20, 30 years. I think, as we know from all of the surveys, the people that we would associate with the social justice left, the woke movement, whatever your preferred term, and I understand why people are dismissive of the word woke, but they are, undergraduate, postgraduate degree holders. They live in the big cities, the university towns. They come from privileged families. They've got a large degree of economic security. And they also disproportionately dominate the institutions. They tend to work in the universities, in the museums, in the galleries, in the BBC, in NPR, New York Times, etc., etc. And so they don't only wield power within the actual corridors of power, but they also wield an enormous amount of cultural power in the national conversation in terms of shaping the prevailing norms, rules, laws, values that they claim represent us. And actually, that conversation is not the conversation that the vast majority of people out there in the country want to have. But on multiple levels, they're wielding political, cultural, and economic power. So they are able to do many of the things that we've seen, in Scotland, where they push for children to be able to legally change their gender without any supervision, or in the UK, where the incoming likely Labour government is saying it's going to give away government contracts on the basis of race and ethnicity, or it's going to make it easier for children to change their gender, or in the US, where we've seen similar calls among Democrats and others to completely overhaul policing, which by all accounts has been a complete disaster in low-income, crime-ridden societies. And, I'm a pollster too, so whenever you put these positions out to the country, they're usually 15 to 20% positions, renaming pregnant women pregnant persons. I mean, that's like supported by 10% of people.
Yeah.
But as we saw in the UK with the CAS review of our National Health Service, what's happened is the elite expert class have gone so far in on things like gender ideology, where they're basically pushing kids down the medical transition pathway. They're not actually anchored in evidence anymore. And that's one of the most disturbing aspects of this for me, that when you look at the expert elite class and, they're all saying, well, why doesn't anybody trust the experts anymore? Well, if you look at things like the major government review, the CAS review, Dr. Hilary Cash, she looked at gender ideology in our healthcare services and basically said, look, a lot of the stuff that's happening here that's being promoted by the expert class just doesn't have anywhere near enough evidence to be happening. I mean, there's just insufficient evidence to be doing this stuff to kids. So I actually think, people have been justified in questioning the experts, because it isn't just about stuff like that review. It's, these disastrous foreign wars in Afghanistan, Libya, Syria, Iraq. It's endless inequality. It's a global financial crash, and not bothering to really punish anybody responsible for it. It's not regulating financial services. It's the constant elite failures for much of the last 20 years that I think have led people to look at all of these issues and think, well, hang on a minute. I'm not actually convinced the expert elite class does get things right. Maybe it is time for something different.
That's right. I find when people, they don't like us using the word woke. And I started thinking, I sort of agreed at first. Now I started thinking about it. I find that really insidious. It's this slippery kind of thing where we know they were using it about themselves, and they even still, many of them will say, "Oh, woke just means being aware of unconscious bias and this kind of thing." And then when we use the word, they go, "Oh, that's a bit simplistic, and that's not the thing." And we know exactly what we mean when we use it. So
Sure.
I think we should say it with
Well, I think
some
woke,
pride.
just briefly, woke is a useful catch-all term. But it's like, don't start the culture war, say the people who started the culture war.
Yeah.
I prefer the term radical progressivism because that's what it is. It's radical liberal progressivism, which has a history that goes back really to the early 1900s in New York and Greenwich Village and the Bohemians, and we can go into all of that if you want. But I think it's a very distinctive ideology with a distinctive history, which has not come from Marxism, by the way. It's certainly been influenced by Marxism, but it's come from within liberalism, and it's got traits of liberalism about it. The kind of obsession with minorities being virtuous, the disdain or the suspicion of the majority group. A lot of that comes from liberalism, not Marxism. And over the last 50 to 100 years has increasingly asserted itself onto the institutions and the cultural fabric. So, whether you call it woke, whether you call it social justice, identity politics, radical progressivism, we all know what it is. I think we have a good handle on what the identity politics part is about. I think moderate liberals and centre-left folks are beginning to wake up to the problems inherent in this worldview. I've been influenced by many people on the left, Yasha Monk, Susan Neiman, Carl Rhodes, David Brooks, David would describe himself as a moderate conservative, but people who, David Goodhart, people who I think have often come from a centre-left position, what we might call a moderate centre-left position, but who have said, well, hang on a minute, this radical progressivism isn't even liberal at all. I mean, what is this? And I think slowly, Tony Blair and Barack Obama and others have sort of been saying, yeah, hang on, this is it's getting too radical, and this isn't really helping the left's cause. Yeah. So it's important. We're not just talking about right-wing culture warriors. We're talking about a growing consensus within the centre right, centre left, and so on, classical liberals, that what we've let out the bag here is not liberal at all.
Yeah, I like that Obama thing. That's not woke. Woke, whatever. That's not cool. I don't know what he said. I don't remember what he said now, but it was good.
Good impression.
Yeah, it didn't come out how I thought. I thought for some reason, I must be able to do an impersonation of someone I've never tried to impersonate before, but it didn't happen. So one of the places we've seen this historically. I know you went back to what was it, Greenwich Village, you say, but Iran in what was it, the 1970s? Was it the leftists siding with the Islamists, and the Islamists got into power with their help and then killed them all. It's the frog and scorpion.
And historians, Tom Holland and others, would argue that what we're living through is something that goes back centuries and draws on many traditions and legacies within Christianity and so on. So yeah, I think we can all agree, and it's been a long time coming, but we are, this debate about have we reached peak woke, which it's a fashionable debate among elites. My instinctive read on that, looking at the surveys of millennials and Gen Z, my instinctive read looking at what's happening in the institutions, is we've only just begun to see what's going to be happening in Western societies. I think this is just going to accelerate the embrace.
Woke's going to get worse.
Yeah, I think the embrace of woke capitalism. I think the embrace of identity politics. I think the rise of centre-left parties that are much more radical on cultural issues than they used to be. And remember, one of the things that is driving this, which takes us into some of the arguments that are popular in the US, one of the things that's driving this is a reaction of radical progressives and liberals to the rise of people like Donald Trump, or the rise of things like Brexit or Marine Le Pen and so on. So as the populists do better, as they're drawing in working class voters and conservatives, non-graduates and so on, as they do better and better at elections, I think liberals are going to radicalize even more the kind of great awakening that scholars like Zach Goldberg and others have tracked. And I think that they're going to become even more committed to this worldview over the next 10, 20 years, because fundamentally, the elite liberal class want to disassociate themselves from the masses, because partly this is about status. They want to be seen as part of what Rob Henderson would call the luxury belief class. They want to project the beliefs that win you status and esteem among the high end of society, and they want to disassociate themselves from the Trump voting, Brexit voting masses. But I think they also genuinely feel threatened. I think they genuinely believe they're living in a revival of German Nazism. I think they think that we're on the end of days, and that Donald Trump is the new Adolf Hitler. And I think in response to that, they are radicalizing and becoming much more accepting of the radical cultural left. And you see that in a lot of the survey data. So this isn't just about people on the right expressing their anger and frustration at what's happening in the West. This is also about the fact that we are living through the greatest radicalization of the elite class since the 1960s. I think we are living through the radicalization of the elite class, of the people who dominate the institutions, who've basically gone off a cliff on a lot of these issues around migration, identity, gender, history, and now basically define themselves by being anti-Western, radically progressive, pro-immigration, pro-Islam, anti-Israel. And for them, it's become now an overriding identity. And that's where I think we are.
Do we have to worry? I mean, we're humans as well. We have the same evolutionary biology. Do we have to worry about also reacting and moving too far the other way and maybe picking evidence that suits our purpose against the woke?
Yes, I think we do. Yeah, absolutely. Everybody is vulnerable to confirmation bias, to choosing the evidence that fits with our beliefs, motivated reasoning, interpreting that evidence in a way that's consistent with our beliefs, to tribalism. But again, this goes back to why free speech, free expression, and a diversity of viewpoints within the institutions is so important, because you cannot counter confirmation bias, motivated reasoning, and tribalism unless you expose people to alternative viewpoints. So if the institutions are all dominated by the same kinds of people with the same kinds of values, with the same kinds of backgrounds and the same kinds of political loyalties, well, we're not going to be able to challenge the confirmation bias and the motivated reasoning and so on. So the institutions become a monoculture, and then everybody else ends up just breaking off. And that is, by the way, why we're seeing the rise of this alternative ecosystem on YouTube and, with the Substacks, with the new television channels, with, all of the new media, which I personally think is extremely positive and beneficial, so long as it remains within the parameters of, a democratic conversation. I mean, I personally have absolutely no interest in anything that would position itself against representative democracy.
Yeah, it does seem that historically, looking back, that there's probably never been an example of the people saying, hey, we need more diversity of thought. We need all the different people being the bad guys. We all need to debate more. We need to talk more. So that's what makes me think, okay, I have my biases, but that's what I'm keeping close to me. It sounds like that's important to you as well.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah. I've got another question for you, but first, where can people find your work?
They find my Substack, Matt Goodwin Substack. So we're now one of the largest Substacks in the UK. We're very countercultural. We challenge a lot of myths and conventional wisdoms. And again, I think that's needed more than ever in our conversation. We have quite a big audience in the US, a lot of Californians with us, who I think probably are seeing many of the same things playing out in America, but primarily Substack and, of course, on X.
Yeah, I was wondering if there's like a microcosm or like a smaller version, I suppose, of what's happening with people coming from different countries to the UK and then trying to change the culture. Would an example of that be maybe San Francisco? You've got the sort of woke left there. They all seem to be moving to Texas, and the Texans are like, what the hell's going on here? And it's like, if you like the Texan life, then maybe it's your views that are wrong, rather than you need to go and enjoy their life and then ruin their state.
Yeah, in the UK, I guess we're seeing, I work at the University of Kent, so we're seeing a lot of Londoners moving out to Kent, and that's creating a sort of mini culture war, because the Londoners, bringing their particular values and priorities and taste to what is a pro-Brexit county, and the locals would refer to Londoners as DFLs, so down from London, and then the Londoners would refer to the people from Kent as DFLs. Dumb effing locals.
Oh, right.
So you've got this ongoing little microcosm of a culture war brewing between the big cities and the provincial areas. And I don't, we're too small to be doing the Texas, Florida thing, but we are certainly seeing a lot of people segregating in response to some of these issues like immigration. Loads of my friends are moving out of London. A lot of people, a lot of Zoomers as well, to go back to Peter Hitchens. It all comes back to Peter Hitchens. The older you get, you realize.
Yes.
But a lot of Zoomers in their 20s, if you stick around the pubs in Westminster, we will hear them talking about the Great Retreat, in terms of where they're going to spend the rest of their lives because they're not going to spend it in the UK. And I think there is an overriding sense that my friend Ed West, who is also he's got a Substack, but he's a very funny and insightful conservative writer, has made this point about us no longer being able to enjoy the nice things because we all now are aware of our, ways of life, cultural traditions, rule of law, stability being undermined and steadily but surely breaking apart. And I think people feel that now in the UK. I was born in 1981, and I think through my lifetime, I've certainly become aware of the extent to which people are, sort of giving up on this culture and civilization, and beginning to think about, moving elsewhere. So maybe we are seeing some similar things to the US.
Who's a heretic you admire?
So somebody who really influenced me is Christopher Lasch, who's an American writer, historian, sociologist, who, if you get a chance, read his book. He wrote a lot of good books. Culture of Narcissism was good. He wrote some really good books on the decline of the family. But he also wrote Revolt of the Elite in 92, 93 on his deathbed. If you go back and read that book now, knowing what's coming, Donald Trump, Brexit, populism, culture wars, elites out of touch. If you go back and read that book now, Lasch was way ahead of everybody else. In fact, I would just say read everything he wrote. He had an enormous influence on me.
That's fascinating. People, get on the Lasch, get on the Goodwin as well. I'll have a link to his Substack down below. Please do. He's given up his time today to be here, so please do go and follow him. Thousands and tens of thousands of people already are, because he's such a great writer. He's one of the best in the business. Please subscribe to this channel, hit the like, and keep on watching this channel with a thing here.